Are you thinking of leaving corporate, but too afraid to make the move? Have you already escaped corporate, but are finding it hard to run your dream business? Are you wasting valuable time by attempting to figure challenges out on your own? We have created a podcast for corporate escapees running their own business. This is the Corporate Escapees Podcast by Build, Live, Give. We bring you first-hand experiences of guests going through many of the struggles you face each and every day as a corporate escapee. We get real with no corporate BS. And now, over to your host, Paul Higgins.
Welcome to Corporate Escapees Stories, brought to you by Build, Live, Give. I'm Paul Higgins and I'm your show host, and today I'm very excited to have Oscar Trimboli from Oscar Trimboli Private Limited. Oscar started out working at Microsoft, and he found himself drifting towards coaching and speaking. At one stage there, he had about a third of his role, he said, was coaching and speaking. And he had a very supportive boss and a very supportive MD here in Australia, and they encouraged him to make a change in that way. And he goes into an enormous amount of detail around that journey and how he went about it. And there's some great lessons for all corporate escapees within that. He also talks about his current fears and how he deals with them on a day-to-day perspective. He really opens up and gives you some great information. He also talks about his gift, about how he's doing some amazing work on helping you to improve your deep listening. He's got a great podcast on this, but he also gives an enormous amount of content on this podcast. So if you're really busy at being busy, I think this will be a fantastic episode for you. So what I'll do now is hand you over to Oscar Trimboli from Oscar Trimboli Private Limited. I hope you're inspired by listening to our wonderful guest stories. All of our guests know the one ingredient to rapidly grow their dream business. That is picking the right suppliers. Let's face it, it's too hard doing it all on your own. So with this in mind, we have created a free on-demand training which gives you the 4 essential questions to ask suppliers. I've combined my 18 years experience at CocaCola and 7 years advising corporate escapees all over the world to give you actionable advice in less than 25 minutes. Simply go to buildlivegive.com/webinar. If you are tired of underachieving and want to fill gaps in skills, please watch our on-demand training now. The link will also be in the show notes. Please check it out. Welcome, Oscar Trimboli, to the Corporate Escapees podcast, brought to you by Build, Live, Give. So, Oscar, I know we met quite some time ago, but a lot of our audience don't know a lot about you. So why don't you just start with something that your friends or family would know about you that our audience wouldn't?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Saturday morning, you'll find me in summer swimming in a beach ocean series, and Saturday mornings in winter, you'll find me running half marathons with an organisation called CAN2. They're a cancer research funding organisation, so they help people get from the couch to a half marathon or a marathon, trail run, a triathlon or an ocean swim, and even learning how to sing in public. And it's fantastic because it's something I do with my wife, and she's a much better swimmer than I am. So she whips me in the pool on a Thursday night and whips me in the ocean during summertime, and then the roles are reversed in winter where I'm a little bit quicker than her. And CAN2 does a phenomenal job of helping first-time cancer researchers get the funding grant they never get because they never have that proof. So the easiest way to get research grants in Australia is to already have got one. So you have a system whereby if you're a long-term cancer researcher and you've been funded, you get continuing funding. But CAN2 believes that the biggest breakthroughs and innovations and new ID come from the next generation of cancer researchers. And 17,000 people have raised nearly $20 million over the last 15 years through CAN2. And that's where you'll find me on weekends and during the week. And my wife and I are mentors in that organisation. So we help the coaches and the team captains to help people cross the finish line with a smile.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, keeping fit while giving back. That's very much in our theme of Build, Live, Give. But I know you and I met each other at a coaching course some years ago, and I just left corporate, and I think you were still working at Microsoft but looking to leave. Why don't you sort of take listeners through your corporate escapee journey?
Yeah, it was a question that I'm challenged by, because one of the things I spend a lot of time when I'm coaching people is going, if you're escaping from something, you've probably got the wrong motivation. And you want to think about what you're going towards rather than what you're leaving. So I was in a really fortunate position during my time at Microsoft. I spent 11 years there, the last 5 as a marketing director, looking after the Microsoft Office division. And during that time, it was a division going through significant change. We had to move from DVDs to the data center and into the cloud. So we had to move from revenue models that were about one-off payments to revenue models that were paid by the month. And a lot of our reseller organizations were very concerned about what that meant for the relationship. And our resellers range from Harvey Norman at retail to IBM and Hewlett Packard at the biggest corporate end of the spectrum. And what had happened was my managing director had asked me a couple of times to help these people understand, what does that change mean for their people, their profitability and their processes, because it's a really big change for organizations who were paying, for example, sales reps commission based on invoices on really big lump sum transactions, to all of a sudden paying reps commission on small annuity monthly revenue streams. Now, way back in my past, I studied as an accountant, but because I've got dyscalculus, which means I transpose numbers, so think of dyslexia for reading, but only for numbers, and that meant my career as an accountant got cut short really quickly as an audit clerk way back when I was in my at the end of my teens. But what I'd spend time with owners and CEOs and leadership teams in reseller organizations and explain to them the connections between people, profit, and processes. And they were always quite surprised, because a Microsoft person traditionally would have to come and talk to you about technology. But I gained this reputation as someone who could simply explain the connection between what the change in technology meant to the profitability, the people and the processes in the business. I was asked to speak at a number of conferences, both Microsoft and non-Microsoft conferences, and people would start to approach me to say, could you come and speak to our board of directors? Could you come and speak to our leadership team? Could you come and speak at our offsites? And I found this intriguing because, to be honest, it wasn't my day job. What my day job was building out the next generation of distribution and revenue for the Microsoft Office division: Word, PowerPoint, Excel, email, and Skype for Business, which was their telephone system. So I spoke to my boss, and my boss said, I said, look, I've got a concern. I'm spending a good third of my week at the moment in these external environments promoting the connection between people, profit, and process. And she said, keep doing it. We need more of our people to do it, because that's what's helping make people the connection between the change in technology and what matters for their customers. And over time, my boss said to me, have you ever heard of coaching? And I said, no, what's coaching? And she said, you get certified in a process and a way of doing this that makes it simple and repeatable for people. So I went and investigated that. But while I was investigating that, I was put on a stand for a graduate recruitment day. And that's something that I'm super passionate about, next generation leadership. And at Microsoft, everybody was we were at a university, everyone was walking past our stand, and I got really frustrated, and I'd cold call on people and say to the youngsters, have you considered a career at Microsoft? And they'd all say, I'm not a programmer. And I'd say that we have jobs in sales and human resources and marketing and legal and operations, and all things that they'd never considered. So while that was going on, I went to my managing director, Tracy, and said, I'm going to come back in a month, but I think we have to rebuild the graduate program as well. And she said, have you got the bandwidth to do that on top of your day job? And I said, well, I'm passionate about it, so here goes. And I went and interviewed all the graduates who left the company, as well as the graduates who'd gone into new roles inside Microsoft in Australia and then all around the world. And what they said to us is they were just lucky that they knew something more about Microsoft than software developers. So I had these two parallel streams going on where people were asking me to speak about people, profit, and process. And then I went through creating this project inside Microsoft called Microsoft Protege. And Microsoft Protege was rebuilding the graduate program, and that got taken to 13 subsidiaries in mature Western countries around the world. And it was starting to be used as a template inside universities for how to engage with corporations as well. So what we did was we gave them a case study with a real Microsoft problem. So how do you launch Microsoft Office to students as an example? And we let the students solve the problem, and the winning students got to come in for a period of 6 to 10 weeks and actually implement the idea. But what it gave us was a fantastic insight into the talent on the market. And we never had a problem recruiting people from that point on because we had a really early view. So as these two things started coming together, I could start to see what was important to me and the kinds of things I really got excited about. It was about that time that I met you, funnily enough, Paul, that somebody said, get a coach myself. So I did. And my coach gave me very simple advice. She said, Oscar, put aside a year's worth of salary in a bank account and don't touch it. And when you've got a full year of salary, if you want to start your new organization, go ahead and do it. And then the other thing you need to do is to understand the kinds of customers you would like to have in the business that you're going to go and create. And she challenged me to bill $30,000 worth of revenue in the next 90 days. And once I'd done that, I could go and start off myself. The problem was we had this thing called a moonlighting policy at Microsoft, which forbid you for taking any financial remuneration for doing other roles. So you couldn't do any other work at Microsoft. You could only really work at Microsoft, and that was it. So that gets us to the point where I made the decision to leave.
Wow, that's a great story. It was interesting. CocaCola actually had a moonlighting policy as well. So I took it to some lawyers, and they basically said, look, it's pretty simple. Do they really want you as an employee? And I said, I think yes. They said, well, they'll enforce it. If they don't want you as an employee, they won't. So I came up against a similar thing as you did, but I ended up just cutting. So I didn't get the great advice to build up 12 months. I got lots of good advice. I probably didn't get that one, but I ended up just jumping. And I think it was around about the same time as you. And, what was, if you sort of go back then, I think it was, roughly 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more, what were some of the key fears when you finally made that decision to jump?
If I'm completely honest, the fears I have then are still the fears I have now. Can I do it? Do I have the skills to do it? Who am I to even have the ambition to not be an employee? How can you possibly make money? What do I charge? How do I charge? How do I package this up? What do I call myself? Who would want to buy from me? How do I create a way that revenue's not connected to my time? And if I'm moving from employee to working for myself, am I really just trading one boss for many customers who are all my bosses, who have much higher expectations than my boss? And will I get paid even if I invoice people? How do I balance this with everything else I'm trying to do? What is success? How many hours a week should I be putting into this? And am I working too hard, or am I not working hard enough? And all those fears are still with me today, Paul.
Yeah, look, I hear you. I know that a lot of our listeners that have taken the brave step, and I really like your point of going to something. That was the one thing around corporate escapees that I challenged myself, but I completely agree with you. You should always move to something, but it is hard. Like times in corporate for me, I thought were the toughest periods of my life. Standing in front of an MD that was disrespectful and basically belittling you in front of all your peers. I thought that was as bad as it got. But to be honest, there are times running your own business where those fears, you've got no one with you. You're handling them all by yourself. How do you cope? Like, obviously, you're 5 years in, you're successful, you haven't gone back to corporate, so you've done well to stay as long as you have. What are some of the things that you do to help you overcome those fears?
Look, one of the things I was really fortunate in my time at Microsoft, I had amazing leaders to work around, and I was lucky that they were a good balance of men and women. And I know through my work today and for the last 5 years, that's not the case for a lot of people who have a day job. For me, the support networks that I put around myself are really deliberate. Just like Can2, one of the things I learned was if I have an accountability system around me that has a fixed date in the calendar that I have to be there. So for me, it's Wednesdays for runs and Thursdays for swims and Saturday mornings for the run and swim program. And I'm doing that with a group of people. That keeps me accountable. So equally in my own business, what I've been very deliberate to do is to surround myself with deliberate accountability models. So in my coaching work, I have a coaching supervisor, and we get together with a group of 5 coaches over a period of about 120 to 180 days, depending on everybody's travel schedule. And in that group, we're talking about the practice of coaching as opposed to the business of coaching. So we'll talk about things that we're struggling with personally, the kinds of clients that we're being really successful with, and maybe the kinds of clients we're not, and what we can learn from each other in that regard. So that time is very protected in my calendar. I won't move that. I will protect it and not put client appointments there. And it's great for me because I love to learn from others, not just from reading or watching a video. The opposite is true too. I've got a coach for my business, and I'm very deliberate about making sure that my coach is understanding where I'm trying to go for the next 90, 180, 12, 24, and even up to 2030. My 2030 goal is to train 100 million listeners globally to become deep listeners. Because although we spend 55% of our day listening, only 2% of us have ever received any training in how to listen. So when you work back from 100 million people learning how to become deep listeners, you've got to come back to today and tomorrow, and how do you put that all in place? And my business coach does an amazing job of keeping me on track, holding me accountable, celebrating when we go well, commiserating and understanding what we need to learn from that when we don't. Equally, my wife, Jenny, is an amazing support in just getting me to notice 2 things. Oscar, stop worrying about what you haven't achieved. Look at what you have achieved, and stop comparing yourself to people who are further ahead of you. Maybe start comparing yourself to people who aren't necessarily in the same position as you and are just starting off. And then I've got amazing support in my business with my practice manager, Nell, who basically keeps the place running and making sure I'm in the right place with the right people, and we're getting paid, we're invoicing, and our clients have a great experience. And June, who's someone who helps us in the Philippines, who helps us with getting tasks done that need to be automated. So she does a great job of that. So that's kind of the support network that sits around me to make sure that it's not just me thinking about this all the time.
Look, that's great. And deep listening, I know that we'll put links to your podcast in the show notes, but just what a couple of key tips you can give someone that's listening to this podcast today to be a better listener.
Really simply, the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. So there's been research done over multiple decades in different continents across different cultures, and the research is very consistent. The deeper you breathe while you're listening to somebody, the more your brain will be available to hear them. The problem with most of the listening literature is it's came from a field of the 90s that said if you actively listen to the other person, you'll be perceived as a better listener. That makes an assumption that your brain is available to actually listen. If you've got a bunch of jibber jabber going on in your head, it's very difficult to be available to the other person. So the process of breathing deeply does one very simple neurological thing. It accelerates the path of oxygen to the brain, so the brain is available with more CPU cycles to focus on the person who's at the other end of the conversation. So the deeper you breathe, the deeper you listen. Then in 1993, there was a parallel piece of research done that said the most productive conversations between a listener and a speaker achieve a point of breathing synchronicity, so that your breathing actually becomes synchronized when your conversations are the most productive. So for the practitioners of yoga or Pilates or any of the ancient exercise rituals that come from India or from China or from Japan or from the Middle East or from Africa or even from Australia, where Dadiri, the Aboriginal word for deep listening, helps us make sure that we connect our breathing with our listening.
And just a very simple question, but the technique. So if you had to say to someone, how do you breathe deeper? How do you do that? So if I'm listening intently to you, which I am now, how should I be practically doing that?
Yeah. So first thing is to pause, get any kind of electronic anything out of your hand, get any kind of visual stimulation away from your eyes. And this isn't something that you need to anticipate as a yoga pose or something you need to go into a dark room or become a monk to do.
Right.
If you're moving from one meeting to another, if you're drinking a cup of tea or a coffee, if you're about to eat a meal, it's a really simple thing to do. Pause. If you can, close your eyes. That will help. If you can't, that's okay. And take a breath in through your nose. Visualize a square. Hold it down in your stomach, and that starts to form one part of the square. Breathe out through your mouth. That forms the next part of the square. Breathe out completely. Take another breath in through your nose. That forms the next part of the square. And then complete the square and breathe out. And that exercise should take no longer than 45 seconds, 15 seconds for each of those breath routines. It's not hard, but what you'll notice is your breathing will be really shallow when you're not in a period of concentration or focus. And the deeper you can breathe, the better you can slow down the way you think, the more impact you're going to have with anything you do. I remember coming off stage and a lady said to me, she came up to me afterwards and she goes, "I didn't believe a word you said." And I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I have to sit in this audience for the next 45 minutes anyway. And she said, I started to realize I could hear the air conditioning in the building. I could hear the lights. I could hear a hum coming from one of the speakers. But what I realized while I was doing all of that is I could hear your words completely differently to as if I wasn't. She said, it's so simple. And yet, why don't we do it? And I said, it's actually your birthright. The very first thing you learn at 20 weeks inside your mother's womb, the first skill you develop is how to hear. And it's genetically programmed so that when you come out of the womb, you know where your mother is so you can be fed. But the first thing we do when we come out of our mother's womb when we're born is we scream, and we spend the rest of our life trying to be noticed by talking. And if we just balance that out a little bit more, if we just spent a little bit more time being conscious of listening, our conversations would become more productive, our projects would finish on time, our relationships would be much stronger, our clients, we would be solving the problems they actually want us to solve, not the first problem they talk to us about. And as a result of that, there'd be less chaos, conflict, and confusion in the world.
And look, for people listening to this, really, stop, pause back, or go back and re-listen to that. I think there's some really powerful tips that you've given, Oscar, and I've certainly taken notes myself to constantly improve the journey of being a better listener. The next section is around the build section. And if you do walk into a party or a networking event and someone says, Oscar, what do you do? How do you respond to that?
Hi, my name's Oscar Trimboli, and I'm an expert in listening. I help people move from unconscious listeners to powerful, conscious, deep listeners. And I work with organizations and people to understand the practical things they need to do to become better listeners.
And what do people normally say after that?
Wow. I've never heard of anybody who trains people on how to listen. How did you come about to focus on listening? Why is listening so important to you? I'm curious. I've actually noticed the way you're looking at me. It's very different. You're so calm. You're actually listening to all my words, and they like that. They like it. They enjoy it. Too many people either have a laptop or an iPad in between them, or a mobile phone, or as simple as for the parents out there is if you're speaking to your children and you're getting frustrated because they're not listening, you're probably talking not at their eye level. So if you want to improve the listening between yourself and your children, always have the conversation at their eye level. And the easiest way to practice this is if you're on the phone, you might be in a state or you might be at work, visualize yourself while you're on the phone speaking to them, being at eye level. So that means if your children are the same height as you kneeling down, when you're on the phone, kneel down. You'll find you'll listen to them completely differently. And when you're doing that face to face, it'll completely change the dynamic between you and your children.
And, listening and improving listening is a skill I'm sure we could all improve on. But how do you decide on who your ideal client is? Who are the people that you're going to serve? How do you go about deciding that?
As I mentioned earlier, the goal is 100 million listeners by 2030. And they say if you can achieve your goal in your lifetime, you're not being ambitious enough. So we'll wait and see how we go with that. Today, my ideal client is organizations with 500 or more employees. And the reason that is because the cost of listening is so significant for those organizations. In Australia today, we're seeing the cost of banks and financial institutions not listening to their customers, not listening to the marketplace, not listening to the regulators, not listening to stakeholders. And as a result, there's a Royal Commission into banks, which will exact a huge cost, not only cost in legal fees, with a legal firm supporting these people in their submissions to the Royal Commission, but what the Royal Commission will insist has to happen as a result of the inquiry that they're undertaking. So the most common groups I work with are teams who are trying to bring about long-term or complex changes that need to happen quickly, and the kinds of industries that ranges from everything from government organisations, financial services organisations, technology, professional services organisations. And the people who tend to speak to me the first time are people who've been referred by other people, where they'll go, Oscar came and spoke to our team about listening, and the result was our work in progress has dropped dramatically in a professional services firm. So we're billing our clients much quicker, but more importantly, they're signing off the work, so they're paying us much quicker as well. Working with a group of recruiters, helping them understand that questions with more than 7 words are biased questions and unproductive, and helping them ask questions of 7 words or less, which means they're listening on a completely different level, not only to the people they're interviewing for recruitment, but in their business development efforts for their customers as well. I've also worked with medical professionals where doctors, physiotherapists, speech pathologists, osteopaths, chiropractors, all have a very short period of time to listen to the person who's coming in to see them in their consulting rooms. But that's just by taking a little bit longer to understand not the symptoms they're presenting with, but what they like to be different. So rather than focusing on the problem and getting them out of the consulting room as quickly as possible, focusing on the long-term solution. So not only the patients feel heard, but they'll refer them, because that's really different for a doctor to listen to you today.
Mm. And for a person that spends most of his time in talking to doctors and specialists, I'll give you a few names at the end of this interview, so you can help me with my medical practitioners, because believe me, they're not great at that. Well, certainly the ones that I go to. As far as your business model, so you're an expert. You've got an amazing skill. You've developed this. Earlier on, you sort of talked about some of the fears of how do you monetize this? How do I sort of make sure that I'm making this work? How have you gone about deciding how you serve those people? What's your business model to help serve those people?
Yeah, so I think of my business in three parts. The first part is my coaching, mentoring, facilitation work, where I'll work with organizations beyond the listening. That might mean working with a board of directors around a strategic plan. It might mean working with an executive team at an offsite where they're trying to figure out how to realign the business based on a change, maybe legislation, maybe competitive, maybe a product launch, or one-on-one coaching. So that's 1/3 of my business. And that model is selling coaching programs or selling workshops. The next third of my business is actually getting the message out around deep listening, which involves speaking at external events. So, for example, in the next 90 days, I'll be speaking at events with the Australian Event Producers Association. So these are the people who actually organise events all year. They're having their annual conference where they all get together and learn a bit more. I'm speaking at an education conference, and I'm speaking at a risk management conference. So getting the message out and speaking is the most powerful way for me in terms of time to get a really good return or ROI for business development. The best way for me to grow my business is to speak. The other way I do that is through my podcast series, the Deep Listening podcast series, where I interview expert professional listeners and expert personal listeners. So an expert professional listener might be a journalist, might be a lawyer, might be a judge, might be a workplace mediator. They might be an air traffic controller. And a personal listener may be somebody like a suicide counsellor over the telephone, or a foreign language interpreter, or a deaf interpreter, or a speech pathologist, or an audiologist. So what I'm trying to do there is create a palette and an artifact for people so they can listen to professional listeners and full-time listeners and understand the simple techniques, tricks, hacks, so that they can become better listeners every day. A simple example of that is the Alan Stokes, Lifeline counsellor. One of the biggest points he made is don't use questions with the word why in them. They're loaded with judgment, and people get very, very, very defensive when you ask questions that start with the word why or imply the word why. And that became one of the most powerful, most downloaded episodes, because people realized they were doing that more than they needed to. And most people get defensive because the first time people get asked a why question is when they get caught out as children and their parents ask you, why did you do that? And so they automatically become defensive around that. I also have written 2 books now, and I'm in the process of finalizing the third. And the third book is the 125-400 rule, the art and science of listening, which basically means you speak at 125 words a minute, but you can hear at up to 400 words a minute. So your neurology is designed to distract you. And I provide some simple tips, techniques, and tricks across 5 levels of listening to improve that as well. I'm also working on building a diagnostic model, which will eventually become an app, so people can kind of answer a few questions to understand why they are good listeners and how they could become better, or why they're poor listeners and how they could get a little bit better there as well. So to reach 100 million people, obviously I'm not going to be able to do that all by myself. I'm going to need some help from technology, and figuring out the last third of that journey is something that is the child that suffers the most from me in my work. When I think about the thirds, that's the really long-term, impactful, powerful work that I know I need to invest much more time in, but it really is an investment that's going to pay huge dividends, that'll make a difference, not just make money in the long run.
And I know that you've been part of Microsoft, its leadership. I know that you did some great work around their grad program, etc. But you've got your team, so the practice manager, and also I know you said someone in the Philippines. What have you done differently, or have you done anything differently for managing a small team like that versus what you did in corporate?
I think some of the principles are pretty consistent. Have a clear view of what we're trying to achieve together. Make sure that people believe in that vision through the recruitment process, and help them to understand how we're making progress along the way. So I think those parallels are consistent, whether that's a big team or a small team. I think the other thing with a small team is that I'm a perpetual experiment. I'm a work in progress. I'm trying things that are working. I'm trying things that are failing. And I don't do a great job of communicating that well to my team. So sometimes I'll go, oh, so we're doing a podcast series. Okay. So how are we going to build some processes around that, Oscar? And as opposed to, hey, guys, I'm thinking about building a podcast series, and away we go. So I think the big difference is in corporate, there was a lot of aim, ready, fire, whereas in my own business and practice, it's more fire, aim, ready. Yeah, that worked. Let's go with that. I've learned that I'm really poor at anticipating what the market needs. And the listening work has all come out of client assignments where they keep saying to me, how did you do that? Can you teach me how to do that? And in my work, it's more helping the team understand that we're there to serve and we need to adapt, rather than having a very fixed way of thinking about what success is at the end of the day, because the people who buy from us change, their customers change, their competitors change, their market change. We need to be responsive and supportive to that.
Excellent. And I know you've covered off some of the other questions that I had, but one is just around your daily habits. I know you talked about, the physical activities that you do, but just what are some of the other daily habits you do to help you be successful?
I probably struggle with this the most. I don't have great habits in terms of work. I trust my calendar. I trust Nell. I trust June to have me in the right place at the right time and make sure I'm prepared to deliver a great workshop or a great keynote or a great one-on-one coaching session. The one habit that is really critical to me is, whether it's speaking, whether it's coaching, whether it's a workshop, whether it's anything, when I face the client, I always make a point, from the time I walk into the lobby in that building to the time I go and introduce myself to the receptionist, I take those deep breaths that I was talking about earlier on, and I set a very clear intention that I'm here to serve them. I need to get out of my own way. I need to get the stuff out of my head from the time I walk in the building to the time I get to their floor. My mind needs to move from worrying about whatever's going on in my day or my evening or anything else in my life. And the minute I step into that lobby, I need to be completely focused on them. So breathing becomes so important for me then. And if I haven't got myself into a place, if the building's got a lift, for example, if I haven't got myself into a place by the time I get to the lift, I actually wait for a couple of lifts. I have to be in a place and create a presence and a state for me so that I know that I can serve the people that I'm going to go and see. So when I'm working with an executive in a coaching environment, if I am not completely fixated on what they need from me and I've got a whole bunch of jibber jabber going on in my head, I almost feel like, well, it's time to give my feedback to them. So that's why, for me, setting an intention from the time I walk into the lobby to the time I get to reception is probably that one practice that is critical to the success of what I deliver for my clients.
And the last section is around the action section. So I know that I'm listening intently to what you've been saying, but just to sort of flip speeds for a moment, what are your top 3 personal productivity tips other than what you've given? And you may say, I've already given them, Paul, because I think this whole podcast has been a class in how to listen and how to breathe and etc. But have you got any others?
Oh, look, I find this so ironic. At Microsoft, I was the director of the Microsoft Office division, so all we did is spend our time, our day, trying to quantify productivity impacts and what that means in terms of technology. So the big one for me in terms of productivity, and this is really thanks to Cal Newport and his work and writing called Deep Work, not to have any focus on email except twice a day. So I don't have any fixation to reply to emails during the day. If something is incredibly urgent, someone will call me, or Nell will call me, or June will call me, or Jen will call me. Someone will call me if it's that urgent. So number 1 tip is box your email. Don't be a slave to your email. Be really clear that email's there to serve you, not the other way around. None of our clients pay us to reply to email. They pay us for the impact that creates. So number 1, don't check your email more than twice a day. For me, that's the beginning of the day, and that's the end of the day as well. I guess my other productivity app is really whether it's podcasts or audible books. By nature, I love to listen. So rather than trying to read books or consume information that way, in between, in the gaps, driving to appointments or commuting to appointments or catching flights interstate or overseas to appointments, I'll consume content via audio rather than trying to read. For some people, they love to read. Don't stop because of that, but just be conscious of which one's going to serve you best. So rather than 3 tips, I'd say 2. And the tip I always give my clients is don't have 1-hour meetings. If you're trying to schedule a meeting for 1 hour, just make it a 45-minute meeting. If you're trying to schedule a meeting for 30 minutes, make it a 25-minute meeting. You'll be surprised how quickly you get to the chase when you know you're on the clock. And that gives you time back to finish work. It gives you time back to get ready for the next meeting. It just gives you time back to breathe. So 1-hour meetings, make them 45-minute meetings, and 30-minute meetings, make them 25-minute meetings. And you'll be surprised, a lot of those 25-minute meetings for me are really 15-minute meetings, particularly over the telephone.
Excellent, brilliant. Well, Oscar, you've certainly given lots and lots of value, not just your story, and I really appreciate you being so open and honest around the fact that it is still a struggle. And I think that's the whole reason why we created Build, Live, Give, is to help people like you and I work with people and do it together. So I think you've been very vulnerable in that way, but you've also given a lot of brilliant insight into a skill I think we could all improve on, which is listening. So we'll definitely have the link to the Deep Listen podcast, also to your LinkedIn profile and your website, so people can find out more about you and potentially improve their listening skill. But thank you for being such a great guest on the Corporate Escapees podcast today.
Thanks for listening.
Great. Thanks, Oscar. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Corporate Escapees podcast, brought to you by the team at Build, Live, Give. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it with other corporate escapees. If you would like to join a community of like-minded peers, please visit www.buildlivegive.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.